So, we're gonna start just by getting set up with Godot. You should have, if you're using one of the classroom computers, Godot should already be downloaded. If you're using your own computer or you need to download Godot, there's a link here, which will take you to the Godot download page. You should be able to just install it. It's a relatively small program, so you should be able to just throw it into your applications folder and start running it. You do want to make sure that you have the most recent version, which is 4.3. So yeah, that's where you can download it. The other thing that you'll want to download is this scripts folder that is on my GitHub page. There's a bunch of scripts in here that we'll use as we add stuff into the game. For today, we only really need one script, which is the player controller script. So we'll go over that and how that works and how to set it up. Yeah.
There's two here, just the Godot engine or
Just the first one, Godot engine. Yeah, we don't need the .NET unless you want to write C# code, which we're not going to do, but you might, if you want to do that. But yeah, so you're going to download Godot, and then you're going to download the scripts. If you're familiar with GitHub, you could clone the repo into your project folder. But otherwise, the easiest thing to do is just click on this green code button and then click on the download zip. So I'm going to do that now, and then we'll add that into our Godot project in a moment once we create it. There's a link on the schedule page that just says scripts. Okay, so so we need to download the engine, we need to download the scripts. We already have our Piskel files downloaded. I did add an extra sprite to my character to create an idle animation, so I just moved his eyes over just to add something changing for the idle animation because I forgot to do that. So I re-exported it, and that's what I'm going to use. But I still just basically have a few frames here. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to my Finder. I have my MMP 270 folder here, and then I have a new Godot folder. And in here, I'm going to create my Godot project. So it's not going to be part of the project itself will be inside the folder. It'll have its own enclosing folder. And when we're working with Godot, we want to be pretty careful about where our files are. One of the things that can be tricky with Godot is if you move the files around, it can break the file locations in your game project. So if you rename files or move files, you need to be very careful that you do that in a specific way, because otherwise you may end up making your game not work, or you may have to do some stuff to fix it. So generally with game engines, but with Godot in particular, we want to be pretty careful about understanding where our files are, what files we're adding into the engine project, and being careful about renaming or changing any files. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to launch Godot. I have it in my applications folder. I'm just going to use the spotlight and search for Godot. So it looks like that. It's got the little blue Godot icon face on it. So I'm just going to open this up. You can see I have a little test project here, but I'm not going to use that now. I'm going to create a new project. So when you create a project, this is just like the sort of project chooser window. When we want to create a new project, just click on the create button and then give the project a name. So I'll call my project my game. You can call it whatever you want. You may want to change the name later. It doesn't really matter that much as long as we know where it is. And we're going to leave the create folder here on. So it's going to create a folder with that project name for us. But then right now it's set to just throw this in my user folder on the computer, which is not where I want it to be. So I'm going to click on the browse button, and I'm going to make sure to put this in my project folder. So I'm going to go to the desktop, go to MMP 270, and then go to the Godot folder, and then I'll click select current folder. So you can see that it's going to add a folder with my game, but it's changed it a little bit. So it just has a dash and all lowercase. That's fine. Just make sure that you know that, you kind of know what it looks like. Then there's an option here for the renderer. We're going to stick with the mobile renderer. We're going to be working with 2D graphics, so we don't really need advanced 3D rendering. If we did, we would maybe use the forward plus. If you work on a 3D game at some point using Godot, you may want to read a little bit more about this before you decide. But for us, we're just going to be working with 2D graphics, and mobile is going to be perfectly fine, so I'm not going to change anything here. And yeah, that's it. I don't have to set up anything else. So I'm just going to click Create and Edit. And this is going to open the Godot editor, the main interface. But before we get into it, I'm just going to go back to the Finder for a second, and you're going to see here's my game. And right now it's just got a few files in it. It's got the Godot icon, which is just kind of the default icon. And then it's got our project file. This just has some basic information about the project. If we look at that, it's just text-based, so you can just like read, this is the name of the game, this is the renderer we chose, and we haven't done anything else yet, so that's all that's in there. But the project.godot file is kind of like the main file that points to everything that's part of the game. In a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to add some files into our project file, so we'll see what that looks like. Okay, so back to the Godot interface. There's a few buttons up here in the top toolbar. There's the 2D interface, which is where we're going to be most of the time editing in 2D. There's a 3D interface if you're creating a 3D game. There's a script area where you can write code. And we'll look at this a little bit. We won't be writing a ton of code, but we will be looking at the code to see how it interacts with our game. And then there's an asset library where you can download assets that other people have created. These buttons over here are used to play and preview the game. And then you can actually change the rendering engine if you want to here, but we'll just leave that as is. So then in the interface, we have these 4 main areas. We have the file system, which actually shows us our files. So we'll see the files update there. So we don't have to go over the Finder to make changes and move stuff around. But we will see, if we add stuff in the Finder, we'll see it update in there. You can go to that folder if you right-click and go to Open in File Manager. It's going to take you right to that folder on your Finder on your computer or your File Explorer in Windows. This is how we're going to edit our files and create files down here. Above the file system is the scene window where we edit our scene. We'll use this a bunch in a minute. And you can change the interface, you can move stuff around, you can change the colors of things, you can change all of the different parameters, but I'm gonna leave most of the defaults. This big window here is like the main editor window where we kind of move stuff around and design our levels and add in our art and do all that stuff. There's a bunch of tools up here that we'll go over as we need them. This is just an empty scene. Godot organizes everything as scenes. So right now we're just gonna have one scene, which is like our first level. But as we add more components to the game, we'll add things like enemies and items and stuff like that, which will be their own little individual scenes. So everything in Godot is organized into these scenes, whether they're components or levels or anything else. You can add a scene by clicking on this plus button, but we're just gonna use this default. This window over here is the inspector window. It tells us information about the different components in our scene. We'll look at it and use it as we kind of go over stuff. So those are the basics. This guy down here is sort of a contextual editor. So depending on what we're doing, this thing might pop up and we'll use it to edit different parts. So you can see, like if we're working on animation, this animation editor will pop up. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that we'll go over, but those are just the basics to get started. So now I'm going to put a couple images into the project, and we'll see what that looks like. So I'm going to go back over to the Finder. And inside my game folder, I'm going to create a new folder. So if I do this in the Finder, it will update in Godot. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this sprites. So this is where I'm going to add all of my all my images, my sprite sheets. So if I go to Godot, you can see that there's that folder. It just added it right here. So this just mirrors what's on the actual computer file system. So then in my sprites folder, I'm going to add my trees, and I'm going to add my character. So if I go back to Godot, you're going to see what's going to happen is it's going to import those files. So it actually happened really fast, so we didn't see it, but there's my character sprite, and there's my tree sprite. So we're going to add these into our scene and create our first level. And we'll also just talk about all of the different components in Godot as we do that. So to start a scene, I need to start with what's called a node. A node is sort of like a folder on your computer. The node is kind of the basic unit of organization that we have in Godot. So your level is a node, and then the components that are part of the level or scene are also nodes. And different nodes have different properties. So with our 2D scene, you can see it has like a little blue circle. Blue generally corresponds with 2D components in the game. The red circle is for 3D components, and then the green circle is for user interface components, which are typically 2D but could be 3D, but are layered on top of the rest of the scene. And then if we want a different node to start our scene, we can click on Other Node, and that brings up this node chooser window, which we'll use a lot. It has a list of all of the different nodes or components that you can use in Godot. And you can kind of search through all the different types of things in the file system or in the chooser window, or you can search. So if we're searching for like an animation, you might type in animated sprite or something like that, and it'll bring up what you're looking for. So I'm going to cancel this for now. For my root node, I'm going to choose a 2D scene, and I'm going to rename this. So to rename a node, I can just double click on it, or I can right click and click rename, or I can, if it's selected, I can just hit enter on the keyboard. And I'm going to call this level 1, just as a default. And then you can see that it's not saved yet because it has this little unsaved and this little asterisk. So I'm going to hit Command S, or you could go to Scene and go to Save Scene. So I'm going to hit Command S. This brings up this file system dialog, which again is just like same thing as the Finder, but it's within Godot. And what I want to do is I want to be nice and organized, so I want to create a new folder to put all of my scenes in. I tend to organize files by type, so all of the images are in one folder, all my scripts are in another folder, all of my sound files are in one folder. You may have a different way of organizing it, but that's the way that I find to be the easiest. So I'm going to create a new folder by clicking on this button here, and I'm going to call this Scenes. You can use capital letters or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to hit OK. And then I'm going to save this scene as level 1. Okay, so back in our file system, we have the Scenes folder, and here we have level 1. If I click on this, if I leave this and then I double click on this, it's going to open it up here. And if we go back and look at the Finder for a moment, you're going to see there's our Scenes folder, there's level 1. If we want to see what that actually looks like, we can open it up in a text editor, and we can see that it's just some text information. So let's leave this. We don't want to edit that though, so don't do that unless you know what you're doing. Okay, so we've got our level 1 scene. Let's start putting some stuff in here. So there's different ways you can go about it. I tend to create nodes and then populate them. People who are starting out tend to do a lot of drag and drop. There's no wrong way to do it. The sort of downside of drag and drop is that you may kind of throw stuff in the wrong place by accident, versus using the node editor scene will be very specific. So if I want to drag and drop, I can take my trees, let's add some scenery first, and just throw them into the scene. And you can see some contextual information comes up that tells me what's going to happen when I do this. And if I throw this in here, I just have an image. But notice what it did. It created a sprite. Okay, so if you wanted a sprite, that's great. But if you wanted an animated sprite, you didn't actually do what you wanted. So that's kind of the difference. So I did just want a regular sprite with this one, so that's great. I'm just going to leave it. But if you wanted to create that using the editor, what you would do, I'm just going to delete this for a second. You would select the node that you want to add to, and then click the plus button. You can also do this by hitting Command A on the keyboard if you want to go fast. And I just hit escape to get rid of it. So I can hit the plus button, and then what I want is a sprite. And we can see it brings up Sprite 2D. And I'm going to click create. So now I just have a blank Sprite 2D with nothing in it. So I have to change it to look like what it looked like before. So I'm going to hit enter and say this is a tree. And then if I want to add that tree image, the place that I do this is over here in the inspector. You can see there's a texture property. It's the first property of that sprite. And in here, I can click the empty and go to load and go to sprites, and then I can find my tree sprite. So that's kind of the same thing as dragging and dropping. So if you drag and drop, you save a little bit of time, but you might not get exactly what you want. Okay. So now I've got a tree sprite. Let's edit it a little bit. In the interface window, the default tool is the selection tool. So that lets me click on things, and then I can edit them, with this pointer mouse guy. If I have a three-wheel mouse or a trackpad, or actually I guess trackpad does pan. If I have a wheel mouse or a 3-button mouse, which you may want for editing a game, if I do the scroll wheel, it zooms in and out. If I hold the scroll wheel as a button, it does pan, so I move back and forth. If I hit the right button, it gives me some options, this little menu. And then if I hit the left button, the main button, I can select, or once I select something, I can move it around or do other stuff with it. There's a few tools up here where I can isolate things. So if I use the move tool, it'll move the sprite, but it won't do anything else. Like if I click somewhere else, it's still moving the sprite. And actually, this is a good thing to go over. What I'm actually doing right now is moving the level. See how level is selected over here? So I'm moving the level, which is something I don't really want to do. So what I can do is lock the level. So if I click on the lock button, now I can't move the level. And so what I really want to do is move the tree. And so I can do that. I did move the origin point of the level, which is not the end of the world, but it's not really what I want to do. So if you ever do that and you just want to reset it without having to move it back, what we do is go over to the inspector and go to the transform. Every node has a transform. The transform is like transformations to that node. So that includes the position, rotation, scale, and skew. And the really nice thing about Godot is it has this little reset button. So if you make a mistake, I can just click that and it just sets back to the default. It's a lot to cover, but you guys, in a moment, you guys will get to play around with it and you'll get used to it. So now I can move my trees around. That's good. And if I hold shift or maybe control or control and use the scroll wheel, it'll pan up and down. And then I can zoom in. And then if I hold the wheel like this, I can pan. There might be some other key commands for different things. I'm not really sure. You can actually change all of those things. So if you go to editor and go to command palette, you can change all of this stuff. Anyway, so we've got our trees, but you'll notice that all 4 of my trees are showing. That's not really what I want for like a single tree. So this is where we need to use our sprite properties. So we're going to look over here in our sprite 2D and look at the animation properties. So we're not animating the tree, but we are going to use the animation properties to set up how we want it to look. So with our animation with sprite sheets, when we do the character animation in a moment, we'll use this as well. But what the game engine does is it breaks down our images into each frame. And so we need to tell it how many frames there are. The H frames are the horizontal frames. So how many frames are there across? And then the V frames are vertical frames. How many frames are there up and down? So we can see there's 2 frames horizontally. So if I change that to 2, now we just have the 1 column. And if I change V to 2, now we just have our first tree. So that's how a sprite sheet works. That's why we want to export our sprite sheets correctly and have our images centered in the frame and all of the other exporting stuff that we went over before. Okay, so now I can move this tree around and I can start to design my scene. So let's put this guy right here. And then if I want to make another tree, this is really easy to do. If I have this tree selected, I can right click and duplicate, or I can just hit Command D. So if I hit Command D and then move this guy over, I'm going to go back to the select tool for a second. So if I move this guy over, now I have 2 trees. If I go to my animation setting for this copy and choose the next frame, we go to the next frame in the sprite sheet. So now I have 2 separate trees. So when we're designing scenery, this is how we can kind of do it. All right, for some reason it's not letting me click here. There we go. Okay, as I'm moving this stuff around, another useful tool that I have is the grid and snapping. So if I turn on this grid, it'll show me a grid here. And if I move this guy around, it may be kind of hard to see, but it's snapping to those points on the grid. And then if I use Smart Snap, I don't know what the difference is there, but it still snaps. Okay, so I can change the grid if I want. For some reason, I'm having a hard time selecting this guy. Okay, there we go. So down here, I have snapping settings. So the grid offset is 0, that's fine. Grid step, that's how many pixels there are between each thing, and then how many lines there are. So if I want a smaller or a wider grid, I can change the step to like 16. You're going to notice these powers of 2 in Godot as well. Okay, so now I have wider grid steps, and so my snapping goes farther when I move around. So that's if you want like an even spacing in your game design. You may not want that, in which case you can just turn that off. But it makes it a little bit easier to line stuff up. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time clicking on stuff, but there we go. Okay, so let's add a couple more trees. I'm gonna hit Command D and go to the next frame. Oh, whoops, I'm hitting frame. I'm hitting the wrong button. Frame, there we go. And I'll hit Command D one more time and make my last tree over here. Okay, now I've got my trees. So one thing that you'll notice, I have a bunch of sprites here. My level editor is starting to get kind of crowded. It's going to get worse because we're going to add lots of stuff to it. So something that I do a lot is I add little nodes that are basically just like little folders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a generic node 2D and create this, and I'm going to name this trees. And all my trees are going to go in here. So I'm going to grab all these trees. So I'm just going to hit this and then hold shift and grab the last one and just drag them into the node like this. So you can see the node is highlighted. If I was down here, I would just be bringing them below the node, which isn't what I want to do. I'm highlighting the node. So now all my trees are in one tree node. And if I want to move that tree node, I can do that. I can move all of them at the same time. Or if I want to move one tree, I can grab it and move it around. So I like to keep things really organized. So I'm going to add lots of little nodes that are basically like little folders. And then the other thing that's nice is I can hide the trees by hiding the whole thing instead of hiding each individual tree. And then the other thing that's nice about a node is I can lock this node. And so I won't be able to move the trees node, but I can still move the trees. But if I want to make it so I can't even click on the trees, I can click on this no selection button. And now I can't even click on the trees. I can't click on anything that's inside of this group. So if I'm editing a very complex scene and I want to make it so I don't like accidentally click on something else, that's a really good feature to use. Okay, so we've got some trees. Let's add our character, and then we'll talk about a couple of other features. It is a lot to cover, but you guys will have some time to get used to it. Any questions so far? Sweet. Okay, let's add our character. So again, when we drag and drop, we're not going to get the right thing. And I'm looking at the instructions, but I can't get the right thing that way either. So if you do that, it's not the end of the world. You can right click on a node and change the node type. So with our character, we want an animated sprite, not just a regular sprite. So if I drag and drop, I can go and change type and look for animated sprite 2D and change. And that seems to have broken something. Oh no, it just disappeared because I don't have an animation yet. Okay, so let's not do it that way. I'm gonna delete this. You can delete a node just by clicking on it and hitting backspace or delete. Okay, so let's add our animated sprite. So I'm gonna click the plus button. I'm gonna search for animated sprite 2D. I'm gonna click create. And then I'm gonna rename this player. Okay, so we're gonna name the node after what it is. And then notice we have this little yellow warning sign. So if we're missing a component, Godot will kind of try to help us out by saying you need this thing called sprite frames. So I'm gonna say, okay. So to get those sprite frames, I'm gonna go over to my inspector. Notice that the inspector column has like a special animated sprite area that has special features for the animated sprite. So depending on what node you have selected, you're gonna see different options over in the inspector column. Okay, so to make an animation, we go to the sprite frames and we just create some new sprite frames. So the sprite frames is just like a little animation thingy. And we don't need to have this in our files, it's just gonna exist in the level. So I'm gonna click new sprite frames. And when I click that sprite frames button, it brings up my animation window. And if I wanna, once I have this guy selected, you can see there's this special contextual window down here. And we can make that larger if we need more space, or we can get rid of it by clicking on that button. Okay, so let's make some animations. And here's where we're gonna start to need to know what's written in our code, because the code is what drives the animations. And we haven't added the script yet, but the script is expecting specific names for the animations. This isn't how all scripts work, but it's how the script that we're gonna use works. Let's look at our script. We haven't added it yet, but let's just take a look at it on GitHub for a moment. You can see in the top of the script, there's gonna be some comments that kind of explain what you need to add. So here it says the player controller script uses the following inputs: move up, down, right, left, jump, projectile. These are defined, and we'll do this in a moment, but it has some instructions for how to use the script. And then for the animated sprite, we need idle, walk, jump, and projectile animations. Okay. Now I just realized I forgot a node. Whoops, okay. Let's make our animations, but I actually forgot a node to add in here. That's my bad. We'll add it in just a second. Okay, so for our animations, we need idle and walk. We're gonna skip jump and projectile for today. So this default animation, I can just delete this or I can rename it idle. They just add in an animation to get started. So let's rename this idle. I just double clicked on it. And for this, it does actually have to match exactly what's in the code. So it has to be capitalized. You can change the code, but it'll be easier in the beginning just to make sure you have the right name. So then to make an animation, it's pretty easy. We're just gonna click on this waffle button, which will add frames from a sprite sheet. You don't want to drag and drop. If you drag and drop, it's gonna look like that, and we can't fix that. So we're gonna delete that. We're gonna use our waffle button and go to sprites and choose our character sprite. That's gonna bring up this little frame editor. We can zoom in a little bit, and you can see it's got sort of the sprite sheet divided up into frames, but it doesn't match the art. So we need to change it to match the art. So we need to say we have 2 horizontal frames and 2 vertical frames. and then we choose the frames in the animation. So my idle animation is just these 2 frames. So I'm going to click add 2 frames, and then we can see the character here, but we don't see the animation going. So what we need to do is turn on this autoplay, and then in our animation settings, okay, there used to be like a playing button, but maybe it's not there anymore. Maybe I just hit play here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so now we can see our animation. That's very exciting. It looks a little bit static because it's just like going back and forth. So we can create a more complex animation without actually doing more drawings by just copying our frame. So if I click on this frame and just copy and paste, I can add more of the first frame, and now the eyes are just moving once. So I can add a little bit of dynamics to this. This isn't the most sophisticated animation editor in the world. They have another animation editor that does more complex stuff, but we're gonna stick with the basics for now. Okay, so let's add our walk animation. We also wanna make sure this is set to loop. So let's add our walk animation. I'm just gonna create a new animation and call it walk. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna click this waffle and choose the character. It already has this set up, so it remembers the settings for this sprite. I'm just gonna choose my walk frames, and let's hit play. And there we go, there's our walk animation. Okay, so that looks good. I'm gonna save this. And then I actually got ahead of myself. We have to go back and fix a couple things, so I apologize for that. So this is our player animation. But our player node is actually a different node that has some physics attached to it. We're not going to use the physics today, but we will starting next week, so we do need that set up correctly. So what we really need for this is a character body 2D. This is just a special node that has some built-in physics in the game engine. Okay, so this is what we should call the player. And I'm going to put this guy in here. And then this actually should just be its default animated sprite 2D. So when you're doing this, just leave the animated sprite 2D as the name. It needs that to work with the code. So if you have an issue with that, we can fix it pretty easily. Okay, so we have our player. Let's go in. So Godot's giving me another warning. It says you need a collision shape. Again, we're not actually going to set up the collisions until next week, but we're going to add that in to get rid of the warning. So what I'm going to do is click the plus and find a collision shape 2D. And this guy has another warning because we have to say what the shape should look like. So over here in shape, I'm just going to choose a circle. And then, I moved my art. That was a bad idea. Let's reset the art to 0, 0. And we're just gonna make our collision shape roughly the size of the character. This is fine. For now, I'm not gonna do too much with this because we're gonna go over this next week. But for now, I'm just gonna leave this as is. The collision shape, depending on the size of your character, you might wanna use a square or a rectangle or even a capsule. It'll have different effects with the physics. So again, we'll talk about that next week. Okay, now I've got my player. I called it player 2 because I already had a player. Okay, there we go. Now we're all set. And so our last step is to add the script. So we need to move our scripts into our project folder. I'm gonna go back to the Finder, and I downloaded my scripts folder. So I'm gonna unzip that. That's what that's gonna look like. It's kind of a long name, so I'm just gonna rename this scripts so it's a little bit shorter. And then I'm gonna put that in my Godot project folder. So I'm gonna drag this over here. Actually, let's pull this out and just do it like this. So here's my game. I'm gonna drag scripts, whoops. I'm gonna drag this scripts folder right here. So it should just look like that. You should have your game folder, and then we have our scenes folder, our scripts folder, and our sprites folder. That's all we're gonna have for today. Okay, so if we go back to Godot, we're gonna get a bunch of errors. That's because we haven't set everything up to use the scripts. We can just ignore these. And then we're going to add the player controller script to the player. So I'm going to click on the player, and then in the inspector node, I'm going to scroll all the way down, and there's a script property at the very bottom. I'm going to click the empty and click load, and then go to scripts and find my player controller. You can turn this into list view. That might be easier to see. And when I add the player controller, notice that it adds a bunch of variables up here, or a bunch of properties like the speed, slide, friction, gravity, jump, all these different things. So those are all properties in the script. We'll look at this a little bit more next week, but those are all properties that you can edit to change the way that the character works. Notice that it also added this little script icon. If I click on this icon, it brings me to the script editor. As I said, we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but it's useful to be able to look at this and see what is happening. So there's some comments here explaining how to set up the script. Let's put this in full screen for a second. And then if we look through the script, you're going to see some of the stuff that it talks about. Like here's that move left, move right. And down here, you see the jump action. And here you see the walk animation, the jump animation, the idle animation. You also see things like this animated sprite 2D references the node in our player thing. So it does have to have that name. I changed it earlier because I forgot to add it second, but it should say animated sprite 2D. So there's one more thing that we have to set up before this level will actually work, which is what it's talking about right here, which is we need to map the buttons on our keyboard to the actions in the script. And this is useful so that way that we can change the buttons. So if you are doing different things with your game, you may want the arrow keys, you may want the WASD keys. You can set those outside of the script. You can set those in the project settings. So we need to go to project settings. So we're going to go to project and go to project settings. And this is set in this thing called the input map. We can define an action and then associate a key press or some other input. So we're going to add an action called move up and then click add. And then once we add that action, we can click the plus button to set the key or mouse or gamepad or whatever you want. So for up, I'm going to hit W. And then I have to hit OK. If I hit enter, it's going to change to enter. So I'm going to hit W, and then I'm going to click OK. So W will be mapped to up. If I want, I can also say the up arrow is up. OK, so then I need move down. I need move left. I need move right. I need jump, even though we're not going to use it today. And I need projectile, also not going to use it today. It's move. It's written in the script. So if you have the script open, you can see it at the top part here. But it's just move up, move down, move left, move right with the move is capitalized and then the direction is capitalized. Here, I'll put it on this. It's move up, move down, move left, move right. And then jump and projectile. And you can assign whatever keys you want to these. I'm just going to assign like some pretty common defaults. So for move down, I'm going to assign the S key, and I'm going to assign the down arrow. For move left, I'm going to assign the A key, and I'm going to assign the left arrow. For move right, I'm going to assign the D key and the right arrow. For jump, I'm going to assign X. And for projectile, I'm going to assign Z. And for jump, I'll also assign space. Okay. So yeah, we'll have time to set it up if you have any issues with that. Okay, let's go back to 2D view. I think the game will run now. Let's see. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And there's one more thing I want to go over, but we're almost done. So if I want to just run this scene, I can use the scene preview button. And so you can see the trees and you can see the character, and there's my character moving around. So we actually have two more things to do. But you can also see now why the direction matters. So if I'm going to the right, if I go to the left, it just flips the character. That's written in the script. You don't have to have it that way. But, you know, we can modify the script if you want to. Okay, let's add a couple more things. So you can see that the player is moving. But what we really want is the player to be centered on the screen. So to do that, we need to add a camera. So I'm going to click on the player and add in a camera 2D. This is going to set basically like what we see in the scene. And we don't have to change any of the settings, but we just have to make sure enabled is on. That's the default. And then you can set the zoom. I don't really recommend this, but you can zoom in or out depending on how you want it to look. So I'm going to run it again. And now my player is centered and the player can move around the screen. Okay, let's go over two more things real quick. So one thing, the way it's set up right now, whatever is like later in the hierarchy will appear on top. So for example, if I move my player, I'm going to click on this no select button. So I'll move the player. You also, one thing with Godot is you have to be really careful about what you're clicking on. You might have noticed that I was intending to move the player, but what I actually did was move the camera, and that's just going to offset the camera. That's not what I want to do. So you have to be very careful about what you're clicking on. So I want to reset the camera transform. I don't want it to be moved. I want everything to be centered here. What I really want is to toggle on this no select once I'm done creating the player. So now when I move, I'm moving the player node and not anything that's attached to it. I don't want to like move the collision shape. I don't want to move the animation. I want to move the whole player node so that everything moves with it. That's one of the hardest things to get used to, but you'll get used to it. Okay, so if you notice, the player is always on top of the tree because the player is below the tree in the hierarchy. If I move the player up here, now it's always behind the tree. That's the default. Depending on how your game is set up, that might work for you. But for 2D games, what you often want instead is something called Y sort, which is whatever's lowest in the screen on the Y axis is what shows in front. If you want Y sort, you can choose the node that has all the other nodes in it and go to ordering and turn on Y sort. What you'll see now is that if the player is up here, it's behind the tree. And if the player is down here, it's in front of the tree. And it's based on the origin of the player. Since it's centered, when the center of the player gets below the tree, then it is in front. It's easier to see if you have a lot of trees. I'm just going to duplicate all these trees real quick and then move them back here. Oh, I have it locked. Let's unlock it. So I'm going to move all these trees back like that. Maybe I'll go like that. And now it'll be easier to see. So I'm going to lock this up. And so now you can see kind of goes in and out of the trees. Although the trees are not Y sorting very well. But I'll figure that out later. We don't need to fix that right now. Okay. There's a million other settings. Those are just kind of the basics to get started. So that's what we're going to work on today. One last thing, if you're working on a Retina screen, your game might look really, really small. Just for a quick way to fix that before we, deal with that, if you go to project settings and you go to the display window and turn on advanced settings, you can turn off allow DPI. This way it'll just show it the way your art looks. If you want it to use Retina later, you can do that, but I would just turn that off for now. That's just something that you're going to notice pretty soon if you're on a Retina screen. Okay. Last little thing is, what are we going to submit for our blog post for this week? So what I want you to submit is your 2 sprite sheets and then just a screenshot of your Godot game running. So to do that with the Godot game running, just run the scene. And so we can see that the scene is running. You're just going to have your character and some scenery. And then I'm going to hit Command-Shift-4 and space. And I'm going to hold Option and just take a screenshot of the game window. So I have a little screenshot of the game window. It's not going to look amazing. It's going to look like whatever you get through today. It doesn't have to be a completely finished game, but we just want to document our progress so far. So to submit this, I'm going to go to the Open Lab, and I'm going to create a new post. And I'll call this Godot intro. And I'm going to grab my screenshot and throw it into documentation. So we'll call this Godot scene 1. And so I'm going to upload this first. And I'm going to say I added some trees and my character into Godot. And then just add your sprite sheets, just so we can see the art that you created. So I'm going to go to my sprites folder and just upload. These are going to be really small, but that's okay. We're just going to see the work that we created. I accidentally overwrote my character. Okay, there we go. So we just have a screenshot of the game, our scenery sprites, and our character sprites. So once we've got all that, let's publish this. Let's add a new category. We'll call this Godot documentation. And publish that. And then that's what you'll submit on Brightspace. Just that link. So you don't have to submit like your Godot project or anything like that. Just this link to your Open Lab post, where we'll just see the game window and your sprite sheets. Okay, so that was a lot. So it takes a lot just to get started, but in our future lessons, we'll just cover specific things as we add new stuff to the game. So yeah, I'll stop here.